This video is brought to you by me, I guess, kinda. As long-time viewers of the channel will know, around this time of year, I start sticking my hand out and asking for money like the junkies at your local transit hub. But unlike Uncle Ringo and them, you don't have to worry whether this next handout is going to be the one that finally sends me up yonder. For the last 6 years or so, me and a very small, literally 2 handfuls of volunteers have been distributing book bags and school supplies to the community where I grew up, or at least close enough to it, because honestly, there isn't really a space big enough near my old block to pull it off, but whatever. Point is, poor kids are getting what they need to do the knowledge and all that. And with y'all's help, last year was the biggest one we've done yet. So kudos to y'all, I guess. Nah, jokes aside, thank y'all. That said, my goal is to double what we did last year, so that's 500 bags. And you know, y'all hear folk like me talk all the time about praxis. Well, here's some for you if you can't find it or don't know what praxis means. And don't worry, neither did I until I started this stupid channel. Really, don't worry about it. Go to the GoFundMe link in the description and be a blessing to somebody today. Now, I'm not going to lie to y'all and say that what you give to me, you'll get back in the form of a new G-Wagon or a 4-bed colonial or something. Or I guess I could, and I could probably start a church at least half the size of Jake's by tomorrow.
Have you ever been swallowed up?
But I will say that you'll give the little homies and homettes around the way one less reason to give OG Mud Dog the time of day once school time comes around. So yeah, I'm basically a one-man crash unit is what I'm saying, with 10 times the efficacy. Again, go to the link in the description and give a couple dollars to help some kids in need today, man. All right, let's go ahead and get to what y'all really came here for. On the night of June 13, 2018, my wife went into labor for the first time. Due to a number of different health issues that I don't care to get into, she was considered high risk for the duration of the pregnancy. And so instead of just checking into the local hospital that was literally around the corner from where we lived at the time, we made the drive to Hospital, University, Pennsylvania at 1 in the morning. About 9-ish and a half hours later, my first child was born, my son, Joseph. 2 years prior to that, the Academy Award-winning film Moonlight was released, and I'm not gonna lie, I didn't really get the hype. Sorry. Considering how much was made about how much this film challenges ideas of black male sexuality, I don't know, man. I think I was just expecting more than the old-fashioned by beachside Moonlight, which, not gonna lie, does sound pretty nice actually. Point being, I knew 1 or 2 DL dope boys growing up. I also knew kids with abusive parents. As I've said in the past, I have been abused myself. I have several former drug addicts and drug dealers in my family. None of this was new or shocking or challenging to me at all. Honestly, I felt like all the hype was just based on the fact that white people didn't know that gay gangsters existed in the hood, and as we always say on this channel, it doesn't exist until white people learn about it for themselves. So that was my impression of the movie at first glance. Then I watched it again a few months ago, and it was the first time that I was brought at least close to tears by a movie since, hell, I don't know, Coco? Yeah, man, I don't care who you are. If you don't get choked up at this scene, then you're basically dead inside. The reason why I told that story about my son being born is it took me having a child to realize that I had totally missed the point of Moonlight the first time around. And the reason I missed it was because the movie was really about me, even if I didn't realize it. I was Chiron in some aspects, and in some ways still am Chiron, and probably would be forever if I never became a father. Actually, if I never became a father, I probably would have been Corey from Fences. Matter of fact, there's an argument to be made that I am still Corey from Fences. And that's why 8 years ago, I felt like Fences got robbed by Moonlight. Okay, so I think it's important to set up a little backstory, some lore, as the kids call it these days. My dad was very much a part of my life. He is one of the biggest reasons why I am the way that I am today, for better or for worse. When I talk about the diet hoteps in my family, 7 out of 10 times I'm talking about my pops. He's the nigga that doesn't eat pork or red meat, even though he doesn't go to mosque or church. Whatever, y'all know what I'm talking about, right? He had an Elijah Muhammad portrait in his living room at one point, and once gave me a copy of Malcolm X's autobiography for like my 7th or 8th birthday. Like, all I wanted was some Pokemon cards, man. Damn. Also, I think he and my grandma, by extension, might be the biggest reason why I never actually dated a white girl, even if, I'm not gonna lie, I did kind of want to a couple of times in very specific instances. Please forgive me, Dr. Umar. Actually, no, don't forgive me. I get why they put marshmallows on the yams sometimes. The other part of it was the whole fetishization thing that I experienced in college, but I've already talked about in another video. Go look at my catalog, boost my views, why don't you? 3rd grade was the first time I had went to school with white kids, and I almost immediately developed a crush on this little white brunette girl named Stephanie. Now, that was bad enough, but then I had the impudence, the audacity, the meta-freaking-gated gall to befriend the bluest and blondest white boy you could think of named Kevin, with whom I shared a mutual love for all things Steve Irwin related. So both my dad and my grandma's response was to shuttle me to an impromptu trip to what I thought was going to be the Baltimore Harbor, and instead turned out to be the Great Blacks and Wax Museum in the same city. Those of y'all who know already know where this is going. Now, the admittedly not so historically accurate giant wax effigy of Hannibal Barca crossing the Alps on an elephant that awaits you when you walk in aside, there really isn't too much in there that my 8-year-old self would consider traumatizing. Well, I mean, that is if you don't count the human zoo exhibit upstairs, or the Klansmen with noose in hand chasing 2 wax children about my size and complexion up there as well, or the plethora of antebellum torture devices that lie all around the museum, or of course the full model slave ship complete with one nigga being force-fed what I can only describe as plaster. And in the ship, even more torture and restraining devices. And of course, around the ship, a school of sharks swimming amidst half-eaten black bodies, is even more being tossed into the gaping maws of wax megalodon. Black history, everybody. But nothing compares to what's under the ship. A literal lynching exhibit that features, among other things, a woman, still alive, mind you, swinging by the neck as her unborn child is being dissected from her womb, along with the rest of her internal organs. Another lynching victim, this time a man, who's also being castrated by a gang of grinning gringos. And also there's a jar of dicks. Black history, everybody. It suffices to say that I don't think that this trip had the intended effect of my folks. Like, nigga, I'm 8. Why are y'all force feeding me this so fast? It's too much to handle at one time. And I bet that's what this nigga was thinking. Yeah, I bet y'all thought that was going to be a blowjob joke, didn't you? Not gonna lie, I did too when I wrote it, but monetization. Anyway, my point is my dad was very much of the tough love variety. That isn't to say that there weren't moments of at least superficial tenderness, but his idea of what raising a child, especially a boy, meant is a big reason why I am who I am, and why since the day my son was born, I've pretty much been doing everything in my power to unlearn that. And that's what I want to talk about today. How these two films, even though they tell different stories about black manhood, kind of tell the same one. And even if told in different languages, kind of say the same thing about it in the end. Okay, so let's start with the, in my opinion, less heralded of the two movies. Fences revolves around Troy Maxson, a garbage man in 1950s Pittsburgh who was once a promising baseball prospect, but never made it to the big leagues, a primary source of the bitterness that defines his character throughout the film and the play that it's based on. He largely chalks this up to the color barrier, but later on we learn that Troy spent 14 of his prime years in prison for killing a man during an attempted robbery. It was also in prison that Troy actually learned to play the game in the first place. So yeah, these delusions of grandeur that he has are going to be a common theme with Troy throughout the movie. So just keep that in mind while we analyze his character. It was in prison that Troy also met and befriended one of several primary side characters, his best friend Bono, who's kind of like the Jiminy Cricket or Brian from the first two seasons of Family Guy in terms of this film. We're also introduced to Rose, Troy's wife and part-time foil, Lyons, his eldest son from an earlier marriage, and Corey, his youngest son, whom he had with Rose. We later learn of Troy's own traumatic childhood and he beating his father with his father's belt after seeing his father attempt to rape Troy's childhood sweetheart. Another defining moment in the development of his character that we will come back to a little later on. Troy also has a brother named Gabe, a World War II vet who sustained a head injury and is now mentally disabled. Gabe recently moved out of Troy's house and across the street to Miss Pearl's, which serves throughout the movie as a source of underlying or at least perceived tension between the two, or at least according to Gabe it is. And it's here that we first get a glimpse into Troy's character. Gabe was paying rent to Troy before he moved out of the house, which now is causing strain on the Maxson family finances. Money seems to always occupy Troy's mind, specifically how much is coming out of his pocket, to whom and for what. His role as provider is basically his whole personality throughout this film, serving as both a source of pride and pain, and is often and sometimes even the only explanation or justification he gives for his behavior. Troy, like the vast majority of black men, especially during that time, defines himself according to his ability to provide, very much in line with the ideals of traditional masculinity. So long as he can and does provide, he's pretty much absolved of any other of his shortcomings, and that's if he even acknowledges them at all. What I'm getting at is we all have had and even still have a Troy within 1 or 2 degrees of separation from us. Many of us are even Troys ourselves. And I mean, this is what made Fences so powerful to me. It's like a lot of black millennials and Gen Xers were seeing a version of their own dad from a third person perspective for the first time. And for me, at least, not gonna lie, it was kind of triggering. Fences is in its own way a deconstruction of traditional black manhood, and one could even argue black conservatism. Troy is a case study on just how fragile the identity of the average black man is, and it is so often because of forces beyond our immediate control. We are taught from the time that we're boys that no one really cares about us beyond our capacity to fulfill our assigned role. That's the cost of being a man in this world, a black man especially. Power in exchange for provision. And for this, I freaking hated Troy, man. And I hated him even more anytime I heard old niggas in one way or another sing his praises or even identify with him. Like, I could hear my own dad giving me that same BS lecture that Troy did about not liking Corey. Matter of fact, I bet my left nut and butt cheek that half of y'all got this same lecture at some point.
I go out of here every morning. I bust my butt putting up with them crackers every day because I like you. You're about the biggest fool I ever saw. It's my job. It's my responsibility. A man is supposed to take care of his family. You live in my house, fill your belly with my food, put your behind on my bed because you're my son. Because I like you, because it's my duty to take care of you. I owe a responsibility to you. Now, let's get this straight right here and now before I go along any further. I ain't got to like you. Mr. Rand don't give me my money come payday because he like me. He give it to me because he owe me. Now, I don't give you everything I got to give you. I give you your life. Me and your mama worked that out between us, and liking your black ass wasn't part of the bargain. Now, don't you go through life worrying about whether somebody like you or not. You best be making sure they're doing right by you.
See, if you ask me, the problem isn't in the content necessarily, because, I mean, yeah, he's kind of got a point when you just look at it in that respect. What makes it an issue is that it's a straw man. Corey asked specifically why Troy doesn't like him. And instead of tackling the topic head on, Troy deflects with Black Boyhood Life Lesson number 105, Section A, Clause D. But the older I've gotten, the more I've actually come to sympathize with Troy, because what I realize is that Troy is afraid to tell the truth for reasons that I'll expand upon now, but get a little deeper into later. It's not so much that Troy doesn't like Corey. I genuinely can't say if he does or does not, even though I tend to lean toward the former, but that he fears him. He fears his potential. It's the same potential that Troy had but never got to realize due to factors not totally his own fault. Troy, like a lot of people, takes solace in the idea that his potential and thus he is actually greater than his current condition. But this pride is jeopardized by the fact that there's someone in his own home who has the same kind of potential and might just mess around and realize it one day. And this becomes a problem because that unrealized potential is really the only thing that Troy has in this world that's actually his and his alone. Because what we learn is that Gabe received $3,000 in restitution from the government because of his injury. Troy then used that money as a down payment toward the house that Gabe was once paying rent to live in. Now, there is a conversation to be had about how dirty that was or was not for him to do his brother like that. But my point is, according to traditional standards of masculinity, a man provides, if for no one else, then himself at least. Troy couldn't even afford to buy the house he lives in on his own merit. He needed the help of his disabled brother, someone who, let's be real, is rendered incapable of becoming the masculine ideal, to do the one thing that Troy has built his whole identity on at this point in his life. Again, for anyone else, this might not be such a big deal, but for a man whose entire identity is built on being the hegemonic ideal, this proves to be an enduring source of both strain and insecurity. Take, for example, Troy's relationship with Lyons, who shows up to the Maxon house every payday to ask for some grip. According to Troy, and by that measure, 1950 standards of manhood, Lyons falls woefully short as someone who's unable to provide for not just himself, but his partner regularly. And yet, even in the scolding, it's apparent that Troy takes a measure of pride in not only running down Lyons for his own shortcomings, but proving his superiority to his son in the latter's continued dependence on his father for money. It isn't until Lyons calls Troy on the carpet for his absenteeism that Troy's ego takes a hit and he ultimately relents, albeit with some prodding from Rose, who again serves as a foil to Troy's self-aggrandizing.
Boy, your mama did a hell of a job raising you.
You can't change me, Pop. I'm 34 years old. If you wanted to change me, you should have been there when I was growing up. I come by to see you, ask you for $10, and you want to talk about how I was raised? You don't know nothing about how I was raised.
Let the boy have $10, Troy.
And this is where I begin to feel sympathy for Troy on my latest rewatch. Because yeah, Troy is a dickhole, an unrepentant one at that. But you can see that he feels some level of regret for not being there for Lyons in his formative years. Even though, again, it wasn't completely his fault that he wasn't. But that then begs the question, why though? This is just speculation again, but as a parent myself, I can say that we parents have a tendency, especially in black households, to treat our kids as little more than extensions of our own selves. This is especially true of fathers and their sons. Thus, we rob them of autonomy at a very early age. Furthermore, we judge ourselves according to the way society perceives our kids. It can be argued that we're motivated to set our kids up to succeed, at least according to our own standards of such, as much for their own benefit as it is to say, look at the man that I've made. Only an even greater man could make a man such as that. Man. The catch is, that applies just as, if not more so, when your kid fails to launch, so to speak. And that's how Troy views lying, as a symbol of his own failure as a father, ergo, a man. Y'all see where I'm going with this, right? Troy's manhood is not nearly as secure as he intimates. He's a pufferfish, basically. Because all of the chest thumping and braggadocio behind all of that is a broken and bitter man clinging desperately to any reason to call himself such, even if that means the people around him have to suffer. Which is where Rose comes in. I could honestly do a separate analysis on Rose by herself, but she is the silent sufferer of the film. She tolerates Troy's callousness for no reason than because she knows, even if he doesn't, that he's hanging on by a thread at this point. And if letting him spin a few tall tales and moan about how much of his paycheck she spends will keep him from going off the deep end, then so be it. Where she draws the line, however, is with Corey. Even if she won't vocalize it, she knows what Corey figures out over the course of the movie. And what I stated earlier, that Troy fears his son. He fears competition because he knows that the older he gets and tighter money becomes and the less able-bodied he is, the more vulnerable he is. The only other man in the house capable of usurping him. So this solution, his solution rather, is to crush Corey's flower before it could ever bloom. Yes, he wants Corey to be a man, but just not more man than he is, or at least he wants him to become a man in a way in which he can be able to take credit for. I've told stories in the past about similar experiences I've had with my father, where I had either surpassed or appeared to be surpassing him in ways that he couldn't really take credit for, and his attempts to stymie that, and me growing to hate him for it. But that was before I understood why he did. Now, understand something. I'm not saying that it's justified in any way, because it most certainly isn't. But once I began to see my dad's brokenness, I learned to forgive him for no other reason than because I just felt too sorry for him to hold a grudge. But I couldn't do that until I saw beyond the performance. And that's what Rose is able to see. A broken and bitter man whose fragile masculinity threatens to drive away the people who love him most. She is put in the unenviable position of balancing Troy's deteriorating ego with Corey's nascent one. And it's real easy to throw shade at her for not jumping full stop onto the Corey bandwagon, but you don't so easily cast aside the ones you love, even when they are a POS. It isn't until Troy breaks Rose's one rule that she's completely out on protecting him from himself, in one of the most powerful monologues of the movie, and honestly, an Oscar-worthy performance.
It's not easy for me to admit that I've been standing in the same place for 18 years.
Well, I've been standing with you. I've been right here with you, Troy. I got a life, too. I gave 18 years of my life to stand in the same spot as you. Don't you think I ever wanted other things? Don't you think I had dreams and hopes? What about my life? What about me? Don't you think it ever crossed my mind to want to know other men, that I wanted to lay up somewhere and forget about my responsibilities, that I wanted someone to make me laugh so I could feel good? You're not the only one who's got wants and needs, but I held on to you, Troy. I took all my feelings, my wants and needs and dreams, and I buried them inside you. I planted a seed and watched and prayed over. I planted myself inside you and waited to bloom. It didn't take me no 18 years to realize the soil was hard and rocky and it was never gonna bloom. But I held on to you, Troy. I held you tighter. You was my husband. I owed you everything I had, every part of me I could find to give you. And upstairs in that bedroom with the darkness falling in on me, I gave everything I had to try and erase a doubt that you wasn't the finest man in the world, and wherever you was going, I was gonna be there with you because you was my husband. Because that's the only way I was gonna survive as your wife. You're always talking about what you give and what you don't have to give. But you take too, Troy. You take.
So let's talk about the affair for a minute. Again, it's easy to just chalk this up to Troy being a POS because, I mean, bet he is. But as with most affairs, the sex really is secondary to what Troy was really after. A release. And no, that wasn't meant to be a nut joke. Well, actually, yeah, it was, but again, monetization. Troy says that Alberta is the only person he feels like he can breathe with. There are no expectations with her, no demand to perform, no need to be anything other than himself. The problem is, aside from society itself, no one in Troy's immediate circle has really placed that burden on him, aside from himself. Again. So yeah, you could argue that this is just another in a long line of excuses to justify his trash behavior, and I mean, maybe it is, but I feel for the first time in this movie that Troy is actually being honest. He's being genuine. He's opened up the fence, even if just for a moment, before closing it once more to go on with his performance. That's what makes Troy so tragic, in my opinion, and many black boomer and Gen Xer and even millennial men. Troy could have been a better man than his father. He could have been a good man even, beyond just his capacity to provide. Hell, he might have even been better had he just not made that capacity his entire personality, but he didn't. He became his father in more ways than he'll ever admit. But he doesn't have to admit that simply because he never sunk to the same depths that his dad did. At the end of the day, he can always justify his lack of growth with the fact that he's seen worse. And if for no other reason, he's a better man. Many of us who grew up with fathers that were much worse than we are today have just learned not to be that, have settled on not being that being a replacement for good. But that's the problem. Just not being that is not good enough. That's the definition of a generational curse. Well, I mean, it's not the definition. Whatever, nigga. Because even with all the societal factors having a hand in shaping his character, we can't completely discount Troy's own egomania as a factor for his piss poor way in handling it. If I ever do get around to filming it, I did write a script about Joker maybe like a year or so back, saying basically the same thing about Arthur Fleck. We know that Arthur is diagnosed with some kind of mental illness, but we don't really know what that illness is, leading to a ton of speculation in WebMD searches, including by myself. I won't give too much away in the event that I do wind up filming that video, but in my purely speculative and not at all medical opinion, Arthur belongs in Blackgate more than he does in Arkham. He's not nearly sick enough to excuse his actions, or at least his illness isn't so severe to be considered the primary cause behind him, is my point. As with Troy, we can sympathize, even empathize in places with the pressure, the pain, even the bitterness he feels. But just because we know why he's the way he is, it doesn't excuse the fact that he is, and worse yet, refuses to grow out of that. Yes, Troy has had it hard basically from birth, but he acts as though his trauma is the only trauma that matters, and that's the problem. He feels justified in being the way that he is because, as he puts it, life owes him for the pressure that it has and continues to subject him to. But the thing is, so does Corey. And so does Rose, and so does Lyons, so does everyone else he targets and hurts with his bitterness. That's the part that Troy misses, and he misses it because patriarchy justifies his egomania. Long story short, patriarchy teaches that the world belongs to men. It is our birthright to rule so long as we prove ourselves worthy. Thus, we make the mistake of robbing basically everyone else in our lives of their own autonomy. What Troy realizes, even if subliminally, is the same thing that the planner class did when they created the Overseer. It's echoed in LBJ's famous quote on why poor white voters consistently vote against their own interests, seemingly for no other reason than to spite the colored folk. As men living in patriarchy, no matter how bad the hand we're dealt is, there's always a path to power and ergo pride. Regardless of how short you come of fulfilling your potential or how little potential you had to begin with, you can always access some modicum of power by just keeping the ones beneath you. Yeah, you may not ever be the cream of the crop, but at least you don't have to worry about being the bottom of the barrel. And some, even a lot of men, have learned to settle for just that. Troy has robbed himself of a chance to heal from his broken embitterness by being beholden to hegemonic ideals. But he's done so because patriarchy promises power to those of us who can perform it and perform it well. And at the end of the day, that's all Troy really desires. Power and the pride that comes with it, the adulation of the people around him, the adulation he was robbed the opportunity of earning through baseball, which is why he blisters at the thought of they giving or even receiving more than he does. And at least in his household, he gets a say in how and to who that adulation is directed. Every time Troy is challenged, some might even say offered the chance to let someone in, he uses his role as a defense, arguing that as a man, that's all he has to give, even going so far as to argue that that's all he has to give. And maybe it is all he has to give, but only because giving any more will force him to confront his own brokenness again. Something he's arguably spent the majority of his adult life avoiding. By the end of the film, Troy has alienated himself from his family due to his actions. And at his work, he's alienated from his friends because of the new position he's taken on at work. It isn't until he gets the validation that he's craved since at least the day he left prison that he realizes that it wasn't worth it and that he's lost everything that ever really mattered. And see, that was Troy's first mistake. See, what makes the fight between he and Corey so powerful is how it echoes the fight Troy had with his father in his youth. Corey has learned to disdain his father now, not only due to his attempts to stymie his own growth and not even just because of the infidelity, but because he understands why Troy did those things. It's not just that Troy fears Corey surpassing him, but that the Troy he knows is just a character. The man he once feared was just a mask all along, a fence even, keeping him from seeing how pathetic the actor behind the role truly was. What I'm saying is the real Troy is exactly the kind of man that fence Troy taught Corey to disdain. That's where Troy messed up. He made Corey feel less than because he didn't meet the lofty standards of manhood that even he couldn't meet himself, and arguably comes even shorter than Corey at achieving. Corey's disgust with Troy is as much for what he did as it is his betrayal at finding out his father was a false prophet all along, just like Troy did with his own father. Remember, it was at this point that Troy says that he lost all fear and thereby respect for his father and saw him for the broken mess that he truly was.
You ain't never done nothing but hold me back, afraid I was gonna be better than you. All you ever did was try and make me scared of you. I used to tremble every time you called my name, every time I heard your footsteps in this house. Wondering all the time, what's Pop gonna say if I do this? What's he gonna say if I do that? What's Pop gonna say if I turn on the radio? And Mom, too, she tries, but she's scared of you.
Your mama out of this. Your mama ain't got
I don't know
no...
how she stands you after what you did to her.
I told you, leave your mama
What are you
out of
gonna
this.
do? Give me a whooping? You can't whoop me no more. You too old.
Now, this isn't me saying that fear equals respect. I'm just trying to tell you what this is from Troy's perspective. So back off. It was also in this moment that Troy says that he became a man, intimating that this is some sort of rite of passage, seeing your father broken, naked, and pitiful, and realizing that even if for that fleeting moment, you're a better man than he ever was, or at least in terms of your father's own definition of what makes a man a man. And that's one of the so-called generational curses of black fatherhood, one that many of us still struggle to break, but one that's not impossible to. Okay, so because Moonlight has already been analyzed and think pieced to death by this point, I'm just going to assume y'all already know the central plot and just give the bullet points on things that I caught, or at least that stuck out on my rewatch. Chiron doesn't speak for like the first 10 minutes of the movie, and this is a common defense mechanism that folks develop when they're conditioned to believe that no one really cares how they feel anyway. Just like insert black boy here. And a big part of this movie is how events in his childhood not only serve to shape Chiron as an adult and adolescent, but how it gives us insight into his character at those points in his life. For example, at the 14-minute mark or so, you see the neighborhood kids attempt to engage Chiron in their soccer game, but he refuses, literally backing away from this traditional expression of boyhood masculinity. Chiron's refusal, even if it is a reluctant refusal to conform to the collective's whims, is a trait that endures even into his trap star phase. It's also during his boyhood that we're introduced to a central character at each point of Chiron's development, that being Kevin. Kevin is basically Chiron's Bono, so kind of serves as a conscious in a sort of way, or at least he helps to navigate Chiron through whatever internal conflicts he's experiencing at that time in his life. In each chapter of the movie, we see that an interaction with Kevin winds up being the linchpin of that chapter. These interactions often serve as the catalyst also to the evolution of Chiron's self-awareness.
Why you always letting people pick on you, man?
What you mean?
You always letting them pick on you.
So, what I gotta do?
All you gotta do, show these niggas you ain't soft.
But I ain't soft.
I know. But it don't mean nothing if they don't know.
In chapter 1, Kevin vocalizes a common theme of black boyhood, that bullying is a form of social sanctioning. In black, and I argue in most ethnic minority communities, we have to know that you can perform traditional masculinity. Otherwise, we'll just keep poking and poking until you prove that you can, or we'll effectively just shun you from the collective in adulthood. We do this as both a benefit to the individual and to the collective, but I'd argue it's more so to the collective's benefit. We understand even at a young age, whether we're taught or through observation, that the world just does not treat us the same way that it does other boys, and we must learn to develop a thick outer wall in order to survive, a fence, if you will, to prevent from breaking in the face of society's, at best, apathy toward our humanity, and if we're going to keep it a buck, most times outright hostility. At the end of the day, the number one quantifier of traditional masculinity is wealth, period. You can be as effeminate or literally as queer as you want to be, so long as you got the racks to make up for it. You can still have as much access to manhood and its corresponding privileges than the average hypermasculine bro split bro. But due to a combination of one, lacking communal wealth and thus socioeconomic mobility, and two, the historical dehumanization of black folk, black boys and men are basically playing with a blindfold tied around our face and both hands behind our backs from jump. That said, we are still expected to perform as men if we expect to be acknowledged as such both in and out of community. Thus, we learn from a young age to overcompensate through other traditionally male traits, including but not limited to the expression of dominance, aggression, independence, and hypersexuality, even. Thus, creating a community that effectively mandates hypermasculinity. Additionally, if even one of us fails to perform these traits properly, it reflects poorly on not just that one, but the collective and our collective ability to perform traditional manhood and therefore achieve the hegemonic ideal. The irony is that even if we aren't afforded many of the privileges that come with hegemonic manhood, we're still not afforded boyhood either. We're forced into adulthood much quicker than other boys just because of the way that society perceives black masculinity as being inherently hyper-violent, hyper-aggressive, and hyper-sexually deviant. It's a damned if you do or don't sort of thing. And this is what Kevin is trying to teach Chiron, even as a boy. The fact that you are black and black wherever you go, whatever you do, means you gotta be able to take the heat when it comes. And if you can't, it won't be because we didn't try to teach you, bucko. Even in the scene where Chiron is dancing in the mirror, you can see where some of the boys are watching him from behind as though ensuring he's not having too much fun. At this point, or maybe a little bit before, honestly, I don't really remember that well, is where we're introduced to Juan, who serves as the de facto father figure for Chiron, showing him the kind of tenderness that, one, he doesn't receive at home, and two, and perhaps more importantly, shows Chiron and thereby the audience the duality of black manhood. This is something I'm gonna come back to later on, but Juan's character is so powerful and so important in the little bit of screen time that he gets because he has managed to negotiate his true self with the character his environment and occupation demand of him. You would not expect a dope boy to display this kind of tenderness to a kid he doesn't know. And at least in my experience, if he did, you'd expect that he was doing so to manipulate him into some light work at some point down the line. But that's not what happens. Juan takes a genuine invested interest in Chiron's humanity, opening his own fence to let the boy in and see what the breadth of masculinity really looks like when it's not restricted to what your environment says it ought to be. And that's when I began to realize Moonlight, at least in my opinion, is not so much a commentary on black queerness, so much as it uses queerness as one of a variety of tools to critique black masculinity. And that's what I missed the first time and why I didn't understand why it was so gassed back then. In my opinion, the use of water, specifically the ocean, as a backdrop to each of Chiron's defining moments represents the volatility of black manhood. Yes, it is a source of strength, a necessary one at that. But that's when you know how to navigate it. That said, it will drown you if you don't really know how to navigate it. That's what makes the swimming lesson the most powerful scene in the movie, in my opinion. It symbolizes the importance of male role models in the lives of young boys, black boys specifically in this instance. Living so close to the ocean, Chiron is bound to jump in at some point, but without someone there to teach him how to float, let alone how to swim, the chances of him drowning go up significantly. And that's what Juan is there for. Look, as someone who was raised primarily by women, I'm not going to do the whole, well, a woman can't raise a man to be a man BS because, I mean, shut up, nigga. But what I will say is it's a whole lot harder figuring it out on your own. Just having a man in your life is not enough, is what I'm saying, especially if that man doesn't know how to swim himself. Matter of fact, he'll probably drown the both of y'all, just throwing you into the deep end and jumping in right after, trying to prove a point about his own manhood that no one is caring to look at anyway. But just like I can't teach a woman about her own experience, having someone who knows exactly what it looks like, what it feels like and sounds like to be you and has lived to tell the tale makes giving there What is up with my speech pattern today? Makes getting there tremendously less stressful and harrowing. Point is, despite what gender war Twitter may say, I firmly believe we need positive male role models in the world. But what we don't need are male role models who are role models just because they are male, especially when their own masculinity is just as restrictive and myopic as society says it ought to be. Okay, so before the queer portion of my audience does flame my comments despite me saying, in my opinion, let's go ahead and get to the sexuality portion of the movie. The adults in Chiron's life realizes that he's gay before even he does, much like in real life.
You ever see the way he walk? One.
You watch your damn mouth.
You gonna tell him why the other boys kick his ass all the time? Huh? You gonna tell him? You ain't shit.
They acknowledge, even if passively, that his sexuality isn't something that he can control, but it doesn't change how that sexuality limits, even disqualifies his masculinity, and perhaps even more importantly, reflects on the collective. The expectation isn't necessarily for him to change, but to sequester it. Drug addiction aside, Paula is similar to a lot of black single mothers who feel pressure to fill the role of both mother and father in the home. Often they overcorrect for the absence of a traditional male role model by withholding affection or purposefully being stricter and harsher than they would be if a father figure were in the home. Again, this is not me saying that is right. It's also me saying, though, that it's not with malice. Quite the opposite is true, in fact. Again, it's overcompensation for a lack of resources. It's what many of these mothers believe is necessary to raise a child capable of performing traditional masculinity, even without the presence of a traditional male figure to emulate. Okay, so that little aside, let's get back onto the main role. For the most part, unless they're super duper religious, at least in my experience, a lot of black folk don't really care if you're queer, but what they care about is how much of your queerness you wear on your sleeve. That's what makes you deviant, if that makes sense. You know, we all have that one uncle or auntie with that one friend or roommate who comes over during the holidays, and we tell them, you know, to keep your friend in the other room because granny is old school, and you know, we don't want to cause no drama. You know, she just got out of, she just had a stent placed in their heart. You know how it is. Y'all know what I'm talking about. That's the difference between Chiron and Kevin by the end of chapter 2. Kevin is revealed to be queer himself in this chapter, but he's learned to mask that part of his identity to the point that he can convincingly perform traditional masculinity, even heteroness. But the emphasis here is on performing. Even then, Kevin is not immune to the occasional manhood check himself. In this instance, pressure to police Chiron's deviance in the most hyper-masculine manner possible. Much like real life, Kevin is pressured into punishing Chiron for the approval of his peers, yes, but also to prevent his own masculinity from being called onto the carpet. Even if Kevin weren't queer himself, just a refusal to conform, to respond to the deviance with hostility like his peers, is enough to warrant his own sanction. But the fact that he is queer further incentivizes him to overperform, if for no other reason than to divert attention from himself and wind up exposing his own deviance. In another very powerful scene, some might even argue just as, if not more powerful than the swimming lesson, Chiron refuses to stay down, no matter how many times Kevin punches him. In a similar manner as he did during the soccer game as a child, Chiron refuses to perform the way that he's expected to. He defies this display of ultra aggression, of hyper masculinity even. He being effeminate, he's expected to just submit to the stronger vessel, if you will. But instead of moving backward this time in uncertainty, he moves forward in defiance, accepting who he is and in the process challenging Kevin to do the same for himself, and by extension, the community to do so for the both of them. He's not going anywhere is what he's saying, so they might as well get used to him. And that's a song that Black queers have been saying for practically ever, honestly. But even if Chiron does accept his own identity, it doesn't change his reality. And when Chiron attacks Terrell, it marks his realization of this, that even if he loves him, the community won't. In order to survive, he has to perform. And in order to thrive, he has to outperform his peers. In this moment, Chiron becomes a man in the same way that many black boys do. We accept the reality that in order to access power, we must perform as the community expects. We have to mask, even sequester our true selves, because that's not really what the community wants of us. And that's not what the world rewards. The world rewards performance. So we perform more often than not for the rest of our lives. And many of us, much like Troy, become so absorbed in the character that the character becomes us, like Daniel Day-Lewis. If you know, you know, and if you don't, where have you been for like the past 40 years? In the third act, Chiron adopts Juan's identity down to the gold fronts and toy crown on the dashboard, largely because Juan is the first adult to show a vested interest in him, but also because, again, this is the only male role model that we know of that he has had at this point in his life. But it's more than just adopting Juan's mask. Chiron in this chapter, like Juan before him and even like Kevin, represents the duality of black manhood. There is still an expectation for us to perform in the public eye, but there's also the capacity for tenderness that we more often than not reserve for only the people closest to us. A capacity that many of us never really get to realize because, again, we're so absorbed in the performance that we lose our true selves in the process of it. Stone cold reality of it is, it's dangerous for black men to be vulnerable, to reveal our true selves too often and to too many people, even those with whom we are intimate. And that's not necessarily physically intimate, but whatever, man. Juan and Troy represent two different reactions to that reality. You can either play the game or get played by it. Chiron at this point, his arc is somewhere in between in the middle of the world, as Juan puts it during that swimming lesson scene. It isn't until Chiron reunites with Kevin that we see his fence come down for the first time in what's likely been over a decade. Kevin is already seen behind the mask, even if others don't know it or Chiron himself doesn't know it. Black is a performance, and Kevin knows that, and that is his point. Chiron is not the hyper-masculine, even hyper-hetero street dude that he projects. Deep down, Chiron knows this even. And it's why, in my opinion at least, why he's remained celibate since that one time with Kevin. That part of him that backed away from the soccer game, the same part that wouldn't stay down when Kevin punched him, it won't let him deny his true self to the point of allowing black to consume him fully. He made a compromise that day on the schoolyard. He refused to deny his true self despite the community's disapproval, but he also accepted the fact that he would have to perform to the community's expectations if he were to survive within it. Black is a defense mechanism, nothing more, nothing less. And it isn't until he's in the presence of someone who he knows won't devalue his vulnerability that he's willing to let his guard down for the first time in what's likely years. That's black manhood in a nutshell. And it's why I keep coming back to that swimming scene. Unlike white men, we are not afforded the privilege of moving in and out of performance as we see fit. We never really get a chance to come out of the water, let alone wait for someone to pull us out before we drown. The world doesn't want that for us because they don't see us that way. Even within community, we are expected to swim and to swim perpetually to the point of exhaustion. But that's the hook. No matter how good a swimmer you are, you're going to get tired eventually. And then what do? You float. You learn to occupy a space in the middle of the world again, somewhere between the sky and the ocean beneath, somewhere between performance and the freedom to be your true self. In the moonlight, black boys turn blue is the line that I've been stuck on since I rewatched the movie and since I started this script. There was a popular traveling stage play from when I was a boy called Black Men Cry in the Dark. Now, I have no clue what that play was about, especially since it was based on a book by Michael Baisden, but both lines, when taken at face value, make a point that I've been trying to argue this entire video. Black men have more than the capacity for tenderness, for affection, for vulnerability, but due to forces beyond our control, we can't be that until the lights go out, until nobody is looking. Or at least that's what we're taught. Like Juan says, only you can choose who you're going to be. And it takes a lot of balls to be that and be it unapologetically, no matter who sees. Like I've said in other videos that I've done on black manhood, who said you needed someone's permission to be you, nigga? Who said you had to walk, talk, and present in a certain way for community? Who said if you weren't a ball player, a rapper, or a retail associate aspiring to be the latter, that you were unworthy of companionship? If we're going to keep it a buck, the community decided that. So the community is my point. Like, y'all know by now, I'm really done with this idea of having your blackness, your manhood, or any other part of your identity qualified by people who couldn't tell themselves apart from a caricature. Don't let the opinions of strangers cause you to drown like Troy did is the ultimate lesson I want y'all to take away from this. Learn to love who you are. If for nobody else's benefit, then the folk around you and the folk that may come from you. And be that out loud, because when you do, I promise you there's people out there who will love you too, even if it is a tribe of just you and one other person. There you have it. But you still here, nigga? Bye.
Father of mine, tell me where have you been? Just close my eyes.